Welcome to this audio edition of New Scientist from the 29th of October 2022. In this week's cover story, ahead of the COP27 climate summit in Egypt, we consider the progress on climate action, even in the face of the rush to exploit more fossil fuels because of the war in Ukraine. We investigate the potential effects of artificial sweeteners on our health in an interview with nutrition scientist Alison Silvetsky, and we follow the hunt for habitable ocean worlds beyond our solar system. We also bring you science news from across the globe, your favourite science columnists, plus our strange 7-day roundup in feedback. New Scientist is read to you by Marnie Chesterton, Quentin Cooper, that's me, and Jim Lee.
The Leader. COP27. Causes for concern and hope ahead of the big climate summit. A year on from the Make or Break climate conference in Glasgow, nations have failed to make progress of cutting emissions. But there are reasons for optimism from beyond the meeting rooms. On the 6th of November, the next international climate summit, called COP27, will begin in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Global leaders will once again shake hands, smile for the cameras, and get down to the difficult business of negotiating how to mitigate global heating at the end of a year when its devastating effects became more obvious than ever before. Last year's COP26 summit in Glasgow, in the UK, was billed as the world's last chance to keep the goal of restricting warming to 1.5 degrees C alive. The Glasgow Climate Pact called on countries to come up with more ambitious plans for limiting or cutting emissions ahead of COP27. Hardly any have done so. Egypt's own plans would lead to a 50% rise in emissions by 2030, so it isn't exactly leading by example. And yet there are reasons for hope, albeit largely from beyond the climate summits. The biggest obstacle to progress has been the energy crisis caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The problems have been severe because nations depend so heavily on fossil fuels, and yet they have led to a new rush to exploit even more. So don't expect any major announcements on emission cuts at COP27. Where there may be some progress is in efforts to make wealthy countries follow through on the $100 billion they have promised to provide to help other nations cut emissions and adapt to a warmer world. Adaptation has been neglected, but it is absolutely crucial to help limit the damage done as the planet warms. The main cause for optimism stems from the fact that renewable energy is now the cheapest form of energy just about everywhere. Some governments have thus realised that climate action is the answer to the energy crisis. As the US's Inflation Reduction Act seeks to demonstrate, renewables are not only climate-friendly, but also a stable, cheap, inflation-busting energy source. In the long run, then, the energy crisis could do more than any climate summit to boost global efforts to go green.
News this week. Engineering firms explore plan to slow melting of Greenland glacier. Companies are considering a major geoengineering project that would build a barrier to block warm seawater from reaching the base of Jakobshavn Glacier in Greenland. Major engineering companies are looking at plans to slow the melting of a gigantic Greenland glacier in what would be the first large-scale intervention to preserve ice anywhere in the world. If it goes ahead and if it works, it could suggest a way to slow sea level rise from Antarctic melt too. Norway's Aker Solutions and the Arup Group, based in London in the UK, sent representatives to a meeting in Reykjavik in Iceland on the 12th of October, in which proposals were discussed to construct a physical barrier to slow the ingress of warm seawater to the base of the glacier. John Moore, a glaciologist who has positions at the University of Lapland in Finland and Beijing Normal University in China, says the design concept essentially is you take a heavy pre-made set of concrete foundations that would be gently lowered onto the seafloor, and they provide the anchor for a buoyant curtain. Recent research has found that melting on the underside of the Greenland ice sheet is progressing faster than anticipated. Moore's idea is that the curtain will reduce the flow of warm water from the Atlantic Ocean to the base of the ice sheet. Greenland's ice sheet, the second largest in the world after the one covering most of Antarctica, holds nearly 2.9 million cubic kilometres of ice, enough to raise global sea level by 7.2 metres if it all melted. That would take many hundreds of years, but at least 27 centimetres of sea level rise is already locked in, attributable to Greenland alone. The target for the proposed intervention is the Jakobshavn Glacier, the major drainage point for Greenland's ice melt. The speed of ice flow from Jakobshavn means it accounted for about 4% of all sea level rise in the 20th century. The mouth of Ilulissat Fjord, where the glacier terminates, is some 5 kilometres across, and the project would require a curtain to be lowered across the gap. Moore estimates the cost at less than $500 million per kilometre, so the total bill would come in at around $2 billion. Speaking to the New Scientist Weekly podcast, Moore said, "This is significant funding, but compare that with the costs of Greenland's contribution to sea level rise and the expected damages. It's far, far smaller. It's of the order of 1%. The impacts of sea level rise of a metre and up would be catastrophic. Hundreds of millions of people are thought to be at risk of flooding due to sea level rise by 2100, with the financial cost estimated at many trillions of dollars. Many unknowns remain. Prototypes will need to be built to test how, for example, icebergs pass through the curtain and to assess the impact on nutrient mixing in the fjord and on fish populations. The curtain does nothing to slow surface melting on the glacier, which is significant and increasing. Time is also a factor, and Moore says the project would take 30 years to construct. Any construction project of this scale would also require consultation and buy-in from local people. Ilona Metiainen is an environmental social scientist at the University of Lapland who has been canvassing local attitudes to this kind of engineering intervention in Ilulissat, a town of some 4,600 people near the Ilulissat Fjord. She says Greenlanders are concerned about climate change. The proposal to intervene is a new scientific idea, but the views have been both positive and slightly concerned about possible impacts on livelihoods associated with tourism and fisheries. People have been expressing their interest towards doing climate action in Greenland. That's a good starting point. Hugh Hunt, an engineer at the University of Cambridge, says glacial curtains could slow down and perhaps even reverse the rate of melting of Arctic and Antarctic glaciers. He says if curtains can be made to work, then they might be a very cost-effective approach to protecting us all from significant sea level rise caused by the melting of polar glaciers. However, Paul Christopherson, a glaciologist who is also at the University of Cambridge, says the idea wouldn't change the melting caused by the warmer atmosphere, which is currently the biggest concern in Greenland. He also points out that Antarctica's coastline is longer than Earth's circumference, and the Greenland ice sheet covers 1.7 million square kilometres. He says geoengineering on this scale is unlikely to materialise any time soon, nor on the timescale needed. A green revolution for the necessary reduction in fossil fuel use is underway, and it is crucial that it continues. The funding for the meeting in Iceland came from Fredrik Paulsen, a Swedish billionaire. Moore says he is establishing an advisory committee focused on Greenland and Antarctica with the aim to encourage more investment from Paulsen and other billionaires. Acre Solutions confirmed its interest in the project. Marianne Hagen at the firm says, "We discussed in Reykjavik a possible sustainable engineering solution to reduce the inflow of warm, saline seawater that is contributing to the melting of the ice cap. This is a technically highly challenging project, but we've achieved the impossible before, and we cannot see one reason why we should not try, not least since our purpose is to solve global energy challenges for future generations."
News this week. Quantum watch is a completely new way of measuring time. A quantum stopwatch made of lasers and helium atoms can measure the time that has passed with complete accuracy without counting seconds like other clocks. A quantum watch can tell time without counting it. This stopwatch-like method of observing quantum experiments is a deceptively simple and always accurate way to measure the passage of time. Marta Berholtz at Uppsala University in Sweden and her colleagues based the clock on a type of experiment called a pump-probe experiment. In these tests, a pump laser pulse is sent into a cloud of atoms, raising them to higher energy levels, and then another, less powerful probe pulse is used to measure the effect of the pump. These experiments are crucial for many applications in materials science, notably the development of solar panels, but it can be difficult to measure how much time passes between the pump and the probe. This quantum watch made with helium atoms solves that problem. It's a completely new way of measuring time, says Ronnie Knut, also at Uppsala University and part of Berholt's team. With other clocks, you try to improve timekeeping by making it more and more complex. But in our case, we actually go the complete opposite direction. We use basically the simplest possible structure that could tell time. The researchers first fired a laser beam into a cloud of helium atoms. This put the atoms into a superposition of quantum states, meaning they were in multiple energy levels at once. These energy levels interact with one another, like how, in the famous double slit experiment, a single photon can go through two openings at the same time and create an interference pattern that changes over time. When the researchers measured that interference pattern for as little as 1.7 trillionths of a second, they could compare it to simulations of the interference and find the unique slice of time where the patterns matched, telling them precisely how long the helium atoms had been in the superposition. The non-repeating nature of the interference pattern made it easy to prove without a doubt that the timing was accurate. The benefit of this is that, unlike a traditional clock, there is no need to measure exactly when the atoms were put into a superposition. If you're using a counter, you have to define zero. You start counting at some point, says Berholtz. The benefit of this is that you don't have to start the clock. You just look at the interference structure and say, okay, it's been 4 nanoseconds. This is a very elegant experiment that will be very useful in what they call pump-probe experiments, says Gerard Milburn at the University of Queensland in Australia. It won't be useful in measuring time more generally, he says, but in experiments where all that needs to be measured is a delay between two times, it could be extraordinarily accurate. These experiments are so ubiquitous when studying small-scale systems that change quickly that an improvement in accuracy could be crucial. This could allow researchers to make extraordinarily fast measurements of systems that change over time, such as a single molecule falling apart, quantum interactions between light and matter, or a material being exposed to a magnetic field.
News this week, JWST spots smallest galaxy outside our local universe. Using the heaviest known cluster of galaxies called El Gordo as a giant lens, the James Webb Space Telescope, the JWST, has glimpsed the smallest galaxy outside our local universe, and it's 1,000 times less massive than the Milky Way. El Gordo was first discovered in 2011. Follow-up measurements found it contained so much mass, the equivalent of 3 million billion suns, that it was at the very limit of what standard cosmological theory predicts. This huge mass makes it useful as a gravitational lens, bending and magnifying the light from stars and galaxies on the other side of it that would otherwise be invisible to us. Now, José Diego at the University of Cantabria in Santander in Spain and his colleagues have used JWST to observe the infrared light from El Gordo and found 28 new galaxies that hadn't been visible before, as well as a dwarf galaxy that's just 1 billion times heavier than our Sun. Even dwarf galaxies typically contain a few billion stars. The team identified the dwarf galaxy from a strange fluctuation of light from another galaxy called La Flaca that El Gordo had stretched into a pancake-like arc. The only way to explain it is there is a small, tiny galaxy right there, which is probably a dwarf galaxy, says Diego. The galaxy is believed to be 1,000th of the mass of the Milky Way. If this is confirmed, It would be the smallest galaxy observed outside our local universe, which includes the Milky Way and its associated galaxies. Its existence could present problems for some physics models, says Diego. The fact that you can see this galaxy is inconsistent with some models of dark matter that predict that dark matter could have a high temperature. Warm dark matter would have a velocity too high to form a galaxy this small, he says. Diego's team also spotted a red supergiant star, a type of star that hadn't been seen outside our local universe, but that JWST could identify using its infrared sensors. If stars that fluctuate in brightness, which also tend to be red like this supergiant, are found by JWST, then they could be used to accurately estimate distances for very distant objects and measure the expansion of the universe. Currently, we use supernovae for this, which can be inaccurate. Seeing such distant dwarf galaxies and red supergiant stars for the first time is pretty amazing, says Felipe Menanto at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. However, on their own, these objects won't be enough to help inform our models of the universe's formation. More data points will be needed for that, he says.
News this week. Can geothermal energy supply all of the UK's heating? A committee of MPs has urged the government to exploit the vast amount of underground heat beneath the UK, but realising that potential isn't straightforward. Never mind the gas crisis, beneath our feet lies enough free heat to keep the UK warm not just this winter, but every winter for decades to come. That is according to UK members of Parliament on the Environmental Audit Committee, or EAC, who wrote to the then Business Secretary, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on the 19th of October, claiming that there is enough geothermal energy in the UK to meet the country's annual heating demand for at least a century. The evidence received by the committee was clear and consistent. The UK has significant geothermal resources which can contribute to both the UK's energy security and its transition to net zero, wrote EAC Chair Philip Dunn. The quantity of heat potentially accessible has been estimated between 100 and 200% of the UK's annual heating demand. Given such huge resources, the EAC argues that the government should be doing more to bring geothermal projects to fruition, particularly in the face of spiralling gas prices. But can the UK really ditch gas boilers completely and heat all its homes with warmth from underground? Geothermal energy, which involves extracting the heat from Earth and using it for heating and electricity, currently delivers less than 0.3% of the UK's annual heat demand. Geologists agree there is great potential to scale the contribution up. But figuring out exactly how much of the UK could run on geothermal energy is less straightforward. The most comprehensive study to date on the UK's geothermal resources is more than 40 years old. The paper, paid for by the Department of Energy and the European Union, concluded that there is at least 200 years' worth of heating and hot water in sedimentary basins around the UK. Later studies have made slightly more conservative estimates. A 2017 paper by John Glias at Durham University in the UK and his colleagues, later cited by the British Geological Survey, suggests that geothermal energy resources in the UK are sufficient to deliver about 100 years of heat supply for the entire UK. They could also provide the equivalent of 85% of Scotland's and 9% of England's current electricity demand, it added. If we simply abstracted water and didn't put more back in the ground to warm up again, we nominally could supply the heating demand to the UK for 100 years, says Glias. That is just eye-watering. So the EAC is in the right ballpark when it talks about the potential heat under the feet of those in the UK. But translating that potential into warm homes over winter is less straightforward, says Glias. The next question is, could you get at it and could you supply it to where people live and work, he says. That's when it gets a little more difficult. Geologists know very little about the deep geology of the UK, particularly when it comes to predicting temperature and water flow, essential details for scoping out potential geothermal projects. This means there is huge uncertainty around the amount of heat available from the UK's deep geothermal resources, which extract heat from up to 6.5 kilometres underground, says Corinna Abasser at the British Geological Survey. We don't have any wells that go to that depth and have explored what the actual temperatures are and what the water flow rate is, she says, so it's a theoretical value. In many cases, developers need to drill new boreholes to test the geothermal potential of a site, a very expensive process, particularly when there's no gold rush of oil waiting at the bottom of the well. The other part of the problem is geography. Across the UK, particularly in Cornwall, North East England, and southern England, there are hotspots of heat. Geothermal developers need to match these hotspots with demand for heating, says Abasser. Heat doesn't travel that well, so you can only use that resource when you have cities or a big heat demand nearby. Against the odds, some developers are making it work. When it opens in Cornwall next year, the United Downs Deep Geothermal Power Project will become the UK's first geothermal power plant. The site will generate power for the national grid, as well as low-carbon heating for a local rum distillery and a new housing estate. But getting the scheme off the ground took more than a decade, including 5 years to secure funding, says Ryan Law, founder of Geothermal Engineering Limited, the firm behind the project. He agrees with MPs that the UK government needs to step in to incentivise investment in geothermal. That could include the government setting long-term deployment targets, sharing the financial risk of drilling exploratory wells, or guaranteeing that geothermal schemes could win government power supply contracts. Heating all of the UK's homes with geothermal would be a stretch, but it is clear that the country's resources are considerable. Spiralling gas prices might just be the push politicians need to finally tap these reserves, Law hopes. In the UK particularly, we've been a bit lazy because our cost of gas has been very low. And it's only now that there has started to be an economic driver to do this, instead of just a carbon driver, he says. It's just starting to gain momentum.
News this week. Dyslexia linked to 42 genetic variants in biggest study of its kind. Better understanding the genetic variants associated with dyslexia could lead to a test that assesses whether a child is predisposed to have it. In the largest genetic study of dyslexia to date, scientists have identified 42 genetic variants that may influence a person's chance of having it. Dyslexia, which affects up to 1 in 10 people in the UK alone, to some extent, often affects a person's ability to read, write and spell. Although the exact cause is unknown, previous research suggests dyslexia is inherited, with smaller studies linking it to a few genes. To get a wider view of dyslexia's potential genetic associations, Michelle Luciano at the University of Edinburgh in the UK and her colleagues carried out a genome-wide association study on 1.1 million adults, mainly of European origin, of whom 51,000 said they had been diagnosed with dyslexia. These studies involve scanning markers across the complete sets of genomes of many people to find any variations associated with a particular trait or condition. The researchers identified 42 genetic variants that tended to differ between the participants who did and did not have dyslexia. The more of these variants an individual had, the higher their chance of having dyslexia, the results suggest. Referring to dyslexia, Luciano says, "It's a complex trait, and like lots of complex traits, it's influenced by many genes, and each of them by itself has a very small effect on the increasing genetic predisposition of dyslexia." To confirm their results, the researchers created a scoring system for a separate group of 2,800 adults and teenagers based on their dyslexia-associated variants. A higher score was linked to these participants, showing more signs of dyslexia on a reading and spelling test. It isn't known whether any of the 2,800 participants had been diagnosed with dyslexia. Around 1/3 of the 42 genetic variants have previously been linked to conditions such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The remaining links were more novel, with some of these variants also being associated with a lower pain threshold and being ambidextrous. The genetic variants may alter a neurodevelopmental process, says In-Hyun Park at Yale University. This could then affect multiple connections between a person's neurons, which may cause dyslexia, pain sensitivity, and ambidexterity, he says. The 42 genetic variants may not cause dyslexia per se, but could make it more likely to occur if combined with certain learning styles, says Luciano. For example, phonics teaches children to match certain letters with sounds and may be particularly helpful for people with dyslexia, she says. She continues, when people think of genetics, the first thing they might think is that it's something that's fixed, and we know that's simply not the case. Genes operate within environments, so the environment is really important to consider. While much more research is required, the findings could one day lead to a genetic test that identifies children who are predisposed to have dyslexia, concludes Luciano. This could allow for interventions that reduce the development of reading and writing difficulties, she says.
News this week. Proton stretchiness is a puzzle for particle physicists. The particles inside a proton move around when exposed to electric and magnetic fields, causing it to deform, but this behaviour is not well understood. The proton is stretchier than we thought, according to new measurements. But physicists are divided on whether this anomaly will persist in future measurements or if our fundamental understanding of the proton structure will need to change. Protons contain three smaller particles called quarks, which are held together by other particles called gluons, as well as very short-lived virtual particles. When a proton is exposed to electric and magnetic fields, these internal constituents move about according to their charge, causing the proton to deform or stretch. The extent to which the proton can be stretched in this way is determined by its electric and magnetic polarized abilities. These two quantities, which have been measured many times, tell us about the proton's internal structure. In 2000, one of the first measurements of these found that as you examine ever smaller sections of the proton, it gets briefly stretchier in response to magnetic and electric fields before becoming stiffer or harder to deform. However, these results were imprecise, and more recent experiments disagreed, finding that the proton just gets stiffer as you zoom in on smaller sections, which is also what the standard model of the proton predicts. Now Nikolaos Sparveris at Temple University in Pennsylvania and his colleagues have measured the proton's stretchability to a higher level of precision, and also found that at certain length scales it becomes stretchier to both electric and magnetic fields, as in the 2000 result. We see it with a higher precision, says Sparveris, thanks to gathering more data. So the ball now, he says, is on the side of the standard model theory. To measure the proton stretch, Sparveris and his team fired a beam of low-energy electrons at a liquid hydrogen target. In their setup, when an electron moves past a proton within the hydrogen, it produces a photon, effectively an electromagnetic field, which distorts the proton. By measuring how the electrons and protons scatter away from each other, the team can calculate how much each proton is distorted by each photon. While the anomalous result appears similar to the 2000 work, the size of the effect has more than halved, says Judith McGovern at the University of Manchester in the UK. It's very difficult in general to measure the proton's polarized abilities at low energies with high precision, she says, and there's no obvious explanation from current theories for why it should spike as it does in Sparveris' result. I don't think most people took the 2000 result really seriously, she says. I think they assumed that it would go away, and if I'm quite honest, I think most people will still assume that it will go away. Different future experiments, like using a beam of positrons, the antimatter counterpart to the electron, could shed light on whether this anomaly is really there or not, says McGovern. Sparveris and his team intend to do further experiments. We have to eliminate any possibility that this is due to experimental parameter or artifact, so we do plan to go back and perform more measurements, he says. However, if the anomaly remains, there will have to be a revision to our understanding of the proton structure. Other measurements will elucidate whether or not this has an experimental origin, but it seems to be a genuine discrepancy between theory and experiment, says Juan Rojo at Vrije University Amsterdam in the Netherlands. The question is, he says, what does this discrepancy tell us? And especially, what can we learn about the proton structure by understanding these things?
Why Mars has captured our hopes and fears for millennia. From being the celestial embodiment of warrior gods to housing canal-digging aliens, Mars has uniquely endured in the public consciousness. Even today, the red planet still spells adventure, says Stuart Clark. Stuart Clark is a consultant for New Scientist and editor of the upcoming The Book of Mars.
There is something about Mars that captivates us. Throughout history, different cultures and individuals have looked at the blood-red beacon in the night sky and filled it with whatever their imaginations associated with the unknown. Across time, Mars has been the celestial embodiment of warrior gods, an astrological talisman of spiritual influence, a venue for utopia, and the wellspring of horrors beyond belief. Even today, our relationship with the red planet continues to evolve. Of the 5 planets that are visible to the naked eye, Mars is easily the most dramatic, and its observable behaviours have informed our cultural interpretations of it. Yet from the flighty apparition of Mercury in the twilight to the extraordinary beauty of Venus in the gathering evening, the unflinching progress of Jupiter, and the laboured march of yellowed Saturn, Mars has stiff competition. Still, it stands out for 2 reasons. The first is its baleful red colour. The second is that it is the only planet that appears to wax and wane significantly in brightness. Sometimes it is an unmistakable beacon, strangely daunting and burning brightly. At other times it is so faint that it fades to the point of obscurity against the stars. Perhaps it is these comings and goings that have piqued our curiosity through the ages, inviting us to speculate. In his book, The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, published in 1960, noted psychiatrist Carl Jung wrote, "The starry vault of heaven is in truth the open book of cosmic projection." He believed that when we look at celestial objects, we can't help but project our innate hopes and fears onto them. Indeed, Mars has proven itself to be the perfect venue for such projection, as the vast library of stories set on the red planet can attest. Yet these works aren't wholly flights of fancy. The imaginations of writers like H.G. Wells, Ray Bradbury, and Arthur C. Clarke were fed by the leading scientific investigations of their age. The late 19th century was a particularly fertile time for interest in Mars. Telescopes were just starting to resolve the planet's surface features, but due to a strange quirk of human cognition, our brains joined these half-glimpsed landmarks into straight lines. This led to the idea that Mars was a dying planet, with its supposed inhabitants digging canals in a desperate attempt to irrigate the deserts. So widespread was the belief in Martian life that in 1891, when Anne Gauguin established a prize of 100,000 francs in the name of her son, Pierre Guzman, to be awarded to the first person to communicate with extraterrestrials, Martians were excluded from consideration on the grounds that talking to them would be too easy. Despite the canals being thoroughly debunked in the early decades of the 20th century, they continued to be a motif in fiction until the second half of the century. These days we continue to shroud the planet in our hopes and fears. For evidence, look no further than the discussions around Elon Musk's aim to colonize Mars. And while a view of the planet is lost to so many of us because we live in light-polluted areas, our mental image of Mars is perhaps more vivid than at any other time in history. Thanks to space exploration and the internet, many of us can be on Mars at the click of a mouse. But why has Mars endured above all other planets in the public consciousness? I believe it is because the more we discover about it, the better it becomes. It is a world composed of larger-than-life versions of Earth's most exciting landscapes. Mars has taller volcanoes, deeper canyons, colder deserts, and larger dust storms. Everything about it spells adventure, and that is irresistible to us.
The extraordinary JWST is named for James Webb, whose legacy I deplore. James Webb's legacy was to stand for a status quo where queer black people like me could never have a home in the NASA community. Naming the incredible new telescope after him has come to represent the contradictions of my job, says Chanda Prescott-Weinstein. Chanda Prescott-Weinstein is an assistant professor of physics and astronomy and a core faculty member in women's studies at the University of New Hampshire. Her research in theoretical physics focuses on cosmology, neutron stars, and particles beyond the standard model.
Last Christmas, I woke up early in the morning, which is unusual for me. Not only am I a practicing Jew, but it has been a few decades since I was a kid in the household of my non-Jewish parent, waking up eager for gifts. But Christmas 2021 was different. NASA, in partnership with the European Space Agency and other organisations, was launching the next in its series of great observatories. I was up early because I wanted to watch, and because I was nervous as hell. What if it blew up during launch? The final price tag for the instrument NASA calls the James Webb Space Telescope, or JWST, was $10 billion. This sounds like a literally astronomical sum of money, but to situate it in context, Disney's Marvel Cinematic Universe films have grossed almost 3 times this amount in less than the decades invested in JWST. Even so, $10 billion might be relatively small compared with the annual US Department of Defense budget, which is 194 times bigger, but to us in the astronomy community, it is a big number that has drawn bad press over the years. Importantly, one reason why this was such an expensive facility is because it was hard to build. I will spend my life telling anyone who will listen that JWST is an extraordinary feat of human ingenuity. A telescope designed to look deep into space using infrared, wavelengths just beyond those the human eye can see, via the biggest mirror ever launched into space, faced a number of technical challenges. The most obvious one, how to get the mirror up there. The incredible solution was to make a segmented mirror that could be folded for the journey to space, and that would unfold unassisted once it arrived at its destination. So an explosion at launch wasn't the only incident we had to fear. JWST had 344 single-point failures, items and systems that had to work in order for the instrument to succeed in its endeavour. Developing and testing an instrument that was robust against these risks wasn't cheap, nor was it easy. I don't envy the scientists who faced intense pressure, knowing that if this didn't work out, the US Congress might never allow the astronomy community another facility like it. That morning, I was full of another set of complicated feelings too. JWST was going up with the name James Webb attached to it, despite an effort to remove it that I had led with other astronomers. Webb not only played a major role in promoting psychological warfare as a Cold War tactic during his time at the US Department of State, but played a part in the early stages of the Lavender Scare, an anti-LGBTQ+ moral panic. He went on to serve as NASA administrator during the storied Apollo era. Webb presided over an increase in non-openly LGBTQ+ black staff at NASA. At the same time, a NASA employee named Clifford Norton was extrajudicially interrogated by NASA's head of security on suspicion that he was gay and then fired for it. As administrator, Webb was, at the very least, complicit in a status quo where queer black people like me could never have a home in the NASA community. JWST is the greatest telescope humanity has ever built. As I argued with comrades in Scientific American last year, why not name it for someone truly worthy of admiration, like Harriet Tubman, an anti-slavery war hero who probably used the stars to navigate herself to freedom. It is hard to talk about the telescope when using its name means treating it as a monument to a man who stood in the way of freedom for people like me. I've navigated this by coining the phrase "just wonderful space telescope," which, since my September 2021 tweet about it was published in the New York Times, has made its way into the world as an alternative name. There were other complications. JWST was built by defence contractors, which stand for everything I am against. The telescope has, in some ways, come to represent the contradictions of my profession. But rather than take a stand against doing this kind of science, JWST motivates me to keep pushing for a scientific community organised around the value of investing in and caring for people, including nurturing our sense of wonder. In July, the first image from JWST was unveiled. The initial deep field, which used a long exposure time to capture even the faintest objects in a small patch of sky. This one image contained thousands of galaxies, some of which are probably 13 billion years old, almost as old as the universe itself. Many of the galaxies' images were quite visibly distorted by gravitational lensing, suggesting the presence of dark matter. I don't know if I've ever seen a more beautiful snapshot of the cosmos in my life. The cosmic lesson for me, the fight to gather this information in an ethical way, is worth it.
Why we are making progress on climate action even after a tough year. The war in Ukraine has encouraged a rush to exploit more fossil fuels, but there are still positive signs of climate action ahead of the COP27 climate summit in Egypt, finds Michael LePage. Michael LePage is a reporter at New Scientist.
Beneath grey skies in China's Sichuan province, a fighter jet-like drone prepares to take off. Its mission? To release silver iodide into the atmosphere in a scientifically dubious attempt to trigger rainfall and help combat a drought associated with the worst heatwave the world has seen since records began. A few thousand kilometres to the west, meanwhile, authorities in Pakistan declare a climate-induced humanitarian disaster of epic proportions caused not by a lack of rain, but by far too much of it, resulting in deadly floods. The events of just one day, the 25th of August 2022 to be exact, are stark evidence of our new climate reality. Never have the dangers of global heating been so terrifyingly obvious. Yet in terms of global action, we're in many ways going backwards. It's a year since representatives from nearly 200 countries met at the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow in the UK. Key commitments made there have not been kept, partly because of the energy crisis triggered by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's little reason to hope that next month's COP27 summit in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt will change much either. But dig a little deeper, and there are some encouraging signs. Renewable sources of power are more economically competitive than ever. Sales of electric vehicles are taking off. Even the current energy crisis, which has sparked a dash for fossil fuels this year, may ultimately help speed up the clean energy transition. Although it's easy to be pessimistic about climate change policy, is there room for a little optimism about the future? To understand where climate change policy is at ahead of COP27, it helps to go back to the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015. This set a goal of limiting global warming to no more than 2 degrees C above pre-industrial temperatures, and preferably 1.5 degrees C. What countries didn't do is commit to taking the emissions-cutting actions needed to achieve this. They didn't have to, because under the agreement, it's up to each country to say what it will do to tackle climate change by 2030. These voluntary plans are known as Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs. The yawning chasm between aspiration and promises, let alone action, was meant to be closed by a ratchet mechanism. Countries are supposed to regularly increase their ambitions and submit strengthened NDCs. The first turn of the ratchet was due to happen before the COP26 meeting, which was delayed by a year because of the COVID-19 pandemic. To a limited extent, this did happen. Some high-income countries and political organisations, including the European Union, Japan, the UK and the US, did submit strengthened NDCs ahead of the Glasgow meeting, though many others didn't. According to the Climate Action Tracker, an independent group that estimates the impact of climate policies and plans, prior to the Paris Agreement, the world was heading for 3.6 degrees C of warming by 2100, though with a considerable margin of error due to the uncertainties of the climate system. The policies in place today would lead to warming of roughly 2.7 degrees C, give or take a degree or so, by 2100. If countries fully implement their NDCs, it would be around 2.4 degrees C by 2100. So, on the one hand, there has been some progress since Paris, with more than a degree of warming probably averted. On the other, during COP26, the Climate Action Tracker described the policies and plans in place as inadequate when it comes to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C. Indeed, the average global temperature rise could temporarily exceed 1.5 degrees C in the next 5 years and may permanently pass this level sometime in the 2030s. This is going to lead to extreme weather and ever higher losses of lives and property. Adapting infrastructure to cope better will help reduce this, but adaptation is costly too, leading to questions about who should pay. This is why limiting warming is so important. In an effort to keep the 1.5 degrees C target alive, the Glasgow Climate Pact agreed at COP26 called on countries to submit strengthened NDCs ahead of COP27. The deadline was the 23rd of September, but just 23 countries had submitted updated NDCs by then, and only one major economy, Australia, significantly strengthened its targets. Australia has long been a climate laggard, however. Its strengthened NDC merely brings it more in line with other high-income countries. It's gone from being highly insufficient to insufficient according to the Climate Action Tracker's ratings. In fact, not one country has an NDC that is compatible with the 1.5 degrees C target, according to the Climate Action Tracker. Arguably, the only major economy with targets that come close is the UK, where the plan is to reduce emissions by 68% compared with 1990 levels by 2030. But progress towards meeting these targets isn't on course. The UK is massively off track, says Tom Evans at independent climate change think tank E3G in the UK. What's more, recent UK government policy announcements, such as reversing a ban on fracking in England and efforts to extract more North Sea oil and gas, mean the country is going even further awry. The bottom line is that with time running out fast, the world isn't even close to doing enough to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. As Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry, who'll preside over COP27, acknowledged in a video statement on the 19th of September, unfortunately, there's a growing sense that the Paris temperature goal is slipping away. Shoukry went on to call for countries to act more swiftly and decisively, but the Egyptian government isn't in the best position to persuade other countries to increase their targets at COP27. This year, Egypt did submit an updated NDC, which, as with the NDCs of many low-income countries, is conditional on international support, but it didn't contain a stronger target. The Climate Action Tracker estimates that Egypt's emissions would increase by around 50% above today's levels by 2030 under this NDC and rated it highly insufficient. A major reason why some countries are backsliding on climate goals is the energy crisis triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin seems to have thought he could dissuade European governments from supporting Ukraine by withholding supplies of Russian natural gas, which many countries in the region rely on. That has proved largely wrong, but it has left these countries scrambling for other sources, helping drive fossil fuel price surges that are having knock-on effects around the world. Nicholas Huhner at the New Climate Institute in Germany, one of the organisations behind the Climate Action Tracker, says countries facing a gas shortage had three options: reduce their energy usage, accelerate renewable projects, or find alternative sources of fossil fuels. All were necessary, but the emphasis has been almost entirely on fossil fuels, he says. There's a lot of things going in the wrong direction, says Huna. There's a gold rush for new fossil fuels. European countries have been buying coal from all over the world to use for electricity generation instead of gas, and coal generation produces higher emissions. Some coal plants that were due to shut down will now continue operating, while a few that had just closed are resuming operations. Countries in Europe have also found an alternative to Russia's gas in the form of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, which is being imported in ships rather than pipes from countries like the US and Qatar. But this switch isn't looking like a temporary measure soon to be replaced by low-carbon sources. Instead, new infrastructure for compressing and exporting LNG and for importing and turning it back into a gas is being planned and built around the world. Germany is reportedly negotiating contracts lasting decades. If all this infrastructure is built and used, we will miss the 1.5-degree target, says Huna. That is very clear. In addition to finding alternatives to Russian gas, many countries have also introduced schemes to help people and businesses cope with the shock rises in energy costs. But here too, most governments are supporting the status quo rather than accelerating the transition to a greener economy. For instance, help with energy bills should be targeted at those on low incomes, says Huna. He adds that shielding wealthier people from price rises diminishes their incentives to reduce energy use by turning down their heating, for instance, or to invest in energy-saving measures, such as installing insulation. The responses to the energy crisis is thus a lost opportunity. We're not seeing governments universally realising that a stronger double down on renewable energy, on energy efficiency, would actually be the best path out of this, says Evans. However, the energy crisis isn't universally bad news for the climate. Producing LNG, transporting it, and then turning it back into a gas may take a lot of energy, but surprisingly, Europe's switch to LNG may result in lower emissions in the short term than sticking with Russian gas, according to some estimates. That's because the long Russian pipelines to Europe are thought to leak so much methane that this outweighs all the additional energy associated with LNG. The long-term impact of the energy crisis might have environmental benefits too. Russia has no way of selling as much gas to countries outside of Europe. Its capacity to export gas as LNG via ships is limited because it lacks the infrastructure, and a second planned pipeline to China isn't due to be finished until 2030 and will have less capacity than the ones to Europe, says intelligence analyst Oliver Alexander. What's more, Russia's pipeline and LNG infrastructure are dependent on components made in the West that companies are no longer allowed to sell to Russia. I don't see China getting too much of their gas from Russia. They won't put themselves in a similar situation to Germany, says Alexander. China will at some point also try to pivot away from natural gas. If economic sanctions imposed on Russia in response to the invasion of Ukraine stay in place, the country's gas exports may remain lower than they would otherwise have been for years. Its domestic emissions, meanwhile, may fall because the country's economy will be smaller as a result of the sanctions. There may be other ways in which the energy crisis will ultimately lead to a fall in fossil fuel use and a boost for climate action. It is, after all, a stark reminder of the dangers of relying on unsustainable fossil fuels, as Fatih Birol, head of the International Energy Agency, wrote in the Financial Times in September. After winter comes spring. The oil shocks of the 1970s resulted in major progress in energy efficiency, nuclear power, solar, and wind. Today's crisis can have a similar impact and help speed up the shift to a cleaner and more secure energy future. The EU, for instance, is currently negotiating a set of policies designed to achieve its target of reducing emissions by 55% below 1990 levels by 2030. It's made some of these policies more ambitious in response to the crisis and could now exceed that target. This should enable the EU to strengthen its NDC, though that won't happen before COP27. Beyond the energy crisis, there have been promising developments in the US this year. In August, the country passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which has been called the biggest thing Congress has ever done to address climate change. Among other things, it requires $370 billion to be invested in a wide range of clean technologies. While the Act is focused on the US, it will also have a global impact both politically and by helping lower prices for clean technology. Then there's the adoption of electric vehicles, which is proceeding much faster than seemed possible a decade or so ago. Many countries now plan to stop the sale of new cars with internal combustion engines, with Norway set to do so in 2025. Perhaps the greatest reason for optimism is that over the past decade or so, renewables have gone from being prohibitively expensive to the cheapest option in many cases. We've seen a dramatic reduction in the cost of clean technology, and those costs are continuing to come down, says Evans. Renewables are now by far the cheapest energy source almost everywhere. Wind and solar now account for 75% of global electricity capacity growth, up from 20% in 2008. That's still not nearly enough. We need low-carbon energy sources to be displacing fossil fuels, leading to declining fossil fuel use even as global energy consumption rises. But that turning point is getting closer. The economics of renewables is incredibly competitive and will continue to be so, says Evans. This means the current rush to exploit more fossil fuels and build more fossil fuel infrastructure is likely to be a temporary blip. In fact, Hoona thinks much of the fossil fuel infrastructure currently on the drawing board will never be built or used, especially coal-fired power stations. You cannot run them economically, he says. The hope of many is that we're nearing an economic, social and political tipping point where the pace of decarbonisation will accelerate dramatically. We aren't there yet, says Damon Matthews at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, but as costs fall and the terrifying consequences of global heating become ever more obvious, politicians may be emboldened to take ever more ambitious action. The way political and social change works is a whole bunch of incremental changes and then a step change, he says. At some point, we are going to reach that.
It's all about the money. To reduce carbon dioxide emissions and adapt to a hotter world with ever more extreme weather, each country must invest huge amounts of money. But lower-income nations don't have much to spend. At the COP15 climate meeting in 2009, high-income countries promised to provide $100 billion a year in climate funding, mostly in the form of loans. This target has yet to be achieved. For instance, according to Oxfam, the reported amount of funding for 2017-2018 was $60 billion, but the true amount was $20 billion. Part of this climate funding is meant to go towards adaptation, such as improving flood defences. Last year at COP26, high-income nations promised to double adaptation funds to $40 billion a year. Once again, much of this money has failed to be provided, with pledges so far amounting to around $22 billion annually by 2025. In the lead-up to COP27, many lower-income countries and activists are again pushing hard for an agreement on loss and damage. The idea that the high-income nations responsible for most of the global warming so far should compensate the less wealthy countries that are being hit hardest by warming-fueled extreme weather. These events are pushing many countries further into debt. For instance, the recent floods in Pakistan are estimated to have caused at least $10 billion in damage. Ineza Umahosa Grace at the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, at a recent webinar hosted by Carbon Brief, a UK-based website covering climate science and policy, said, "We are not able to see a future because flooding, cyclones and typhoons are washing away all economic development that our countries have been struggling to get. When disaster happens, there's no international process that listens to the cry of a country." High-income nations have long resisted any kind of compensation becoming part of global climate agreements, and there is unlikely to be any substantive progress on this at COP27. US climate envoy John Kerry told a conference in New York in September, "You tell me the government in the world that has trillions of dollars, because that is what it costs."
why we urgently need answers about artificial sweeteners and health. Artificial sweeteners have been shown to help people maintain their weight and improve their health, but they've also been linked to conditions such as diabetes and heart disease. Nutrition scientist Alison Silvetsky has been unpicking the evidence. The interview was conducted by New Scientist's head of features, Helen Thompson.
You could be forgiven for being completely confused when it comes to consuming low-calorie or artificial sweeteners. Some days the headlines are full of praise for their beneficial effects on health, helping people to lose weight by replacing their favourite sugary drinks and treats with similar-tasting diet versions. At other times, we are told low-calorie sweeteners are linked with serious health conditions, from raising blood pressure to an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. Just last month, a large study of French adults claimed to have found an association between consuming sweeteners and an increased risk of heart disease. Alison Silvetsky, an associate professor in the Department of Exercise and Nutrition Sciences at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., is trying to unpick the science involved in this controversial topic. Her work is shedding light on whether artificial sweeteners can give us the sweet fix we seek while helping us to maintain our weight and prevent chronic disease, or whether they should be handled with care. It is widely accepted that too much sugar is bad for you. Artificial sweeteners are a supposedly healthy replacement, so can you tell us some of their proposed benefits?
Sure. We know that too much added sugar is not good for our health. Artificial sweeteners provide a sweet and palatable alternative that has few or no calories. Until recently, it's been the belief that these sweeteners don't really do anything in the body because they don't contain sugar or calories. So the benefit of replacing sugar with artificial sweeteners in foods and beverages is that this replacement lowers the product's calorie and sugar content.
But now it seems that things aren't so straightforward.
Lately, there's been more and more evidence from both rodent and human studies showing that artificial sweeteners may contribute to metabolic abnormalities and various health problems. However, there are trials that show that, when used judiciously, sweeteners may be helpful for weight management. That's where the controversy is. Part of the challenge is that these trials may not reflect the way that sweeteners are actually used in real life, and the studies showing associations between sweetener use and health problems cannot show causality.
What changes when we look at how people use sweeteners in real life?
Most artificial sweetener trials have relied on comparing diet beverages with those with added sugar. Until a couple of decades ago, diet beverages almost entirely contained either aspartame or saccharin. Now there are newer artificial sweeteners on the market, and they've been incorporated into more and more foods and beverages. There's not a lot of research that is specific to particular sweeteners, and studying them is challenging because they're used in diet drinks, but also in yogurts and snack foods, and even in ice creams. They're also used in beverages that aren't even considered diet drinks, and which also have added sugar. So, frankly, it's unlikely that people are using sweeteners as one-to-one replacements for added sugars. And they might be saying, I had a diet soda, so I can have another cookie.
So, are the potential negative effects of sweeteners down to how people are using them, or could sweeteners themselves be causing problems?
I would say potentially both. More and more, we're seeing that these sweeteners are not inert. They don't have calories, and they're not sugar, but they do exert metabolic effects in the body. The big question is, how relevant are those mechanisms to human health? There's a discrepancy in the data. Most of the randomized controlled trials of artificial sweeteners have focused on weight loss, but not on some of the other health outcomes. And the randomized controlled trials are relatively short-term, and the people in them might already be motivated to lose weight. Observational studies link consumption of various sweeteners to unfavorable health effects, including, for example, increased risk of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and stroke. They're not randomized or controlled, but they may better capture real-life exposure to sweeteners in the context of how people actually eat.
Is there one type of sweetener that is worse for you than others? There seem to be different rules for which sweeteners are approved and which aren't, depending on the country you are in.
Most studies group different artificial sweeteners together when studying their effects, but given they are different compounds, they may have different effects. Sweeteners all have different chemical structures, different physical properties. They are all absorbed differently. Some are metabolized, some aren't. They're excreted differently, and they're not always consumed alone. Take sucralose, for instance. Taken in water, there's no effect on blood glucose levels. But there's evidence to show that when it's consumed in combination with sugar, it alters the body's glucose and insulin levels differently than sugar alone. If the mechanism that contributes to poor health outcomes is sweetness, then we would expect all artificial sweeteners to have similar effects. But if the mechanism is compound specific, then sucralose might be different than aspartame, and so on. And it might be a combination of the two, some effects being due to sweetness and some being compound specific.
We've spoken a lot about artificial sweeteners. Do natural sweeteners like stevia have similar controversies around their use?
Unfortunately, there's not a lot of research on the metabolic and health effects of stevia in humans, and it's a really important question because the use of stevia in foods and beverages has increased markedly in recent years. The few studies that have been conducted report that stevia helps reduce inflammation, improves control of blood glucose, and encourages weight management. Stevia may be a favourable alternative to other low-calorie sweeteners, but this is not yet clear, and more studies in humans are needed.
Last month, a study of French adults claimed to show a direct association between higher artificial sweetener use and cardiovascular risk. What do you think it added to the debate?
It was a very well done study. They enrolled a large cohort, and it was unique in that they collected repeated and detailed estimates of food consumption and looked at different sweeteners separately. They also considered sweeteners from foods, beverages, packaged sweeteners, all different dietary sources. The results further justify the need to conduct experimental studies to better understand the metabolic effect of sweeteners in humans.
It's hard for a consumer to make sense of all this. Studies like the French one suggest there may be a link between sweetener use and poor health, but the website of England's National Health Service says they are perfectly safe to eat or drink on a daily basis as part of a healthy diet. Should we be using them or not?
I think it depends on what we mean by safe, because these sweeteners have been extensively tested and approved by various regulatory bodies worldwide with regard to toxicity. But where the debate is focused is on metabolic effects and their role in weight management and chronic disease risk. In this case, the question is, are they helpful or harmful in terms of weight management and chronic disease? We don't have a clear answer to that question yet, but more and more evidence suggests that these low-calorie sweeteners may not be helpful and may actually be counterproductive.
Your own research examines the consumption and effects of low-calorie sweeteners in children. What have you discovered?
We've done several different studies on consumption of sweeteners among children. Studies have shown that the prevalence of consumption of low-calorie sweeteners has been increasing, and particularly in children. That's not surprising, as there is more emphasis on reducing added sugar to food. There's an increased presence of sweeteners, including those that are marketed to and widely consumed by children. This trend is being seen globally, not just in the US, and really highlights the importance of having a better understanding of how these sweeteners are impacting kids in terms of their weight and metabolic health. We have a couple of ongoing studies. One is in kids with type 1 diabetes, where we're investigating how restricting their use of sweeteners affects their glucose levels and metabolic risk factors.
You're still collecting data on this, but what do you expect to see?
In rodents, and now in humans too, studies show that repeated consumption of low-calorie sweeteners, specifically saccharin and more recently sucralose, led to impairments in the ability to keep blood glucose within an ideal range. So we hypothesized that removing sweeteners from the diets of children with type 1 diabetes might lead to improvements in the amount of time they are within target blood glucose range relative to those who continue consuming sweeteners.
Have you got any ideas about possible mechanisms that might be involved?
One of the mechanisms being studied a lot right now is how sweeteners change the composition of the microbiota in our gut. the bacteria in our intestinal tract. Rodent data and a relatively large study from Israel in humans published recently showed that impairments of glucose tolerance are mediated by change in the gut microbiome. They showed that repeated consumption of saccharin and sucralose causes changes in the gut microbiome composition that adversely impact glucose intolerance.
Given the mounting evidence, I'm surprised there isn't more nuanced advice on the consumption of sweeteners.
It's still a highly controversial topic, and it's a polarised field of research. Yes, there's growing evidence suggesting that there may be negative effects of prolonged low-calorie sweetener consumption on metabolism. But it's not yet a conclusive body of evidence. It's important to acknowledge the limitations and critiques of scientific studies. That's how research works, and we want to make sure the science isn't being sensationalised. The study from Israel also showed how personalised the effects of low-calorie sweeteners are on the gut microbiome. It's something that varies between individuals and is challenging to disentangle. There are likely some people who respond negatively to sweeteners and some that do not. The reality is that understanding how these things affect our health takes a lot of time, and we really need conclusive evidence to inform policy.
The hunt for habitable ocean worlds beyond our solar system. Astronomers think that planets covered in water, with oceans hundreds of meters deep, could be relatively common in our galaxy. Now the race is on to find one, reports Connor Feely. Connor Feely is a freelance writer based in Auckland, New Zealand.
It looks like there is nothing below the thick, hot clouds we are falling through. But descend a little further and the vista opens up to show an ocean as far as the eye can see. Its surface is steaming, feeding water vapour into the sky. Plunging into the waves, it is hot at first, but cools as we travel further into the darkness, the pressure becoming immense. We dive down hundreds of thousands of metres until we reach the bottom where, instead of rock, the seafloor is made of ice. We have landed on a water world. When astronomers began discovering planets outside our solar system in the 1990s, they realised that alien worlds come in an array of orbits, masses, sizes, and compositions. These exoplanets couldn't be placed in simple rocky or grassy groups like those in our solar system. Some, it has even been suggested, could be 50% rock and a whopping 50% water. Send a spacecraft to a planet like this, and the scene it would encounter may be similar to our imagined journey. A thick water vapour atmosphere shielding a vast ocean hundreds of kilometres deep with an icy mantle below. It was long thought these water planets would be rare if they existed at all, but fresh insights have led many astronomers to think they may in fact be relatively common and could be promising places to search for alien life. The race is now on to find one. Life, as we know it at least, is inextricably tied to liquid water. Our best guesses about the conditions from which life emerged on Earth involve either nutrient-rich pools of water on our planet's rocky surface or deep-sea hydrothermal vents. Either way, it had to be wet. To this day, all life on Earth uses water at some point in its life cycle. So close is the relationship between water and life that our search for extraterrestrial organisms has been largely determined by the presence of that one simple molecule, H2O. The idea of exoplanets that not only contain water but are covered in the stuff first burst onto the scene in 2004 when Alain Léger, then at the Paris-Sud University in France, and a group of international researchers introduced a new family of planets. These hypothetical worlds initially resemble the ice giants of our own solar system, Uranus and Neptune, which possess vast reservoirs of ice. But instead of remaining in the outer regions of their solar systems like our ice giants, the theoretical ocean worlds migrated during the early phases of planetary formation when everything was a little chaotic. This movement took them closer to their suns, into the habitable zone, the region around a star in which liquid water can exist on a planet's surface. In this scenario, Leger and his colleagues argued a planet's reservoirs of ice could melt, leaving a surface ocean of liquid water potentially more than 100 kilometers deep. With so much water, such a world could be booming with life. But critics found one big problem with the idea. If an ice giant did migrate to an orbit closer to its home star, it was likely to lose its atmosphere, and any ocean on the surface would eventually evaporate away due to the heat of the star. Around the same time, exploration of our solar system was revealing another kind of ocean world. Through NASA's Galileo mission, which spent 8 years orbiting Jupiter until 2003, planetary scientists discovered that a few of the Jovian moons, such as Europa and Ganymede, were hiding oceans beneath thick sheets of ice. Then in 2005, NASA's Cassini spacecraft found evidence of plumes of water erupting from Enceladus, a moon of Saturn. What distinguishes these moons from the kind of world suggested by Leger and his colleagues is that their water isn't at the surface, but buried deep below. For those interested in ocean-rich planets outside our solar system, this solved one problem. You don't have to worry about the atmosphere being stripped away, says Kathleen Mant at Johns Hopkins University in Maryland. The ice protects the water from being lost. But while an icy surface can preserve a water world's oceans and hence its habitability, a different type of ice may threaten it. This is to do with size. If an Earth-sized planet were to have a similar buried ocean to those we have seen on smaller moons, the immense gravity and pressures at the depths possible on water worlds would compress some of the water into exotic forms of ice that don't occur naturally on Earth. For years it was thought this kind of ice may prevent some life-friendly elements that are found in a planet's core, such as carbon, iron, phosphorus and silicon, from mixing with a liquid ocean above. In recent years, research has suggested these high-pressure ices don't automatically rule out the possibility of life. In fact, they might help it. Assuming heavy elements and organic molecules from the rocky core can reach the liquid regions of water worlds, then it is also important that those ingredients are mixed across different depths in the wider ocean. On Earth, similar upwelling and mixing in the oceans opens up different niches for organisms to occupy and provides the raw materials for life over vast oceanic distances. Sam Howell at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California says that in 2018, simulations suggested high-pressure ices may churn through a process called solid-state convection, similar to the movement of rock in Earth's mantle. On top of this, the radioactive decay of heavier elements such as potassium, thorium and uranium in the cores of these planets may provide enough heat to drive this movement. He continues, its possible melt may be generated at the ice-rock boundary, providing a crucial site for the mixing of water and heavy elements. Consensus was building that water worlds with buried oceans or those on the surface, if they were to persist, could be a great place for life to thrive. But astronomers were still uncertain about how common they might actually be in the cosmos. This comes down to the way we study exoplanets. By carefully watching the way planets block some light from their host stars as they pass between them and us, we can infer these planets' masses, radiuses, or sometimes both. If we know both, we can deduce their density. But a rocky planet with a thick hydrogen atmosphere could have the exact same density as an ocean world, says Owen Lima at NASA's Ames Research Center. He continues, how do you know which one is going to be correct when they both might have water in the atmosphere? It's a really interesting challenge, he says. Li Zung at Harvard University offered a solution to this in 2018. Along with a team of astronomers, Zung zoned in on a subset of the 4,000 or so exoplanets that had been discovered at the time, those between 2 and 4 times the size of Earth. When Zung and his team analysed the radiuses and densities of these exoplanets, 2 distinct groups emerged. One for small, dense, rocky planets, and another for larger, intermediate-sized worlds. The prevailing idea was that these intermediate planets, 1,400 or so of them, were mini-Neptunes, planets with rocky cores surrounded by thick envelopes of hydrogen gas, uninhabitable as far as life on Earth is concerned. But these mini-Neptunes didn't quite fit into a neat category. Lima says they are not dense enough to be rock and iron, but they don't seem to be quite puffy enough to be hydrogen-rich planets. Zung and his team suggested that rather than being mini-Neptunes, these planets are water worlds. Planets composed of 50% ice and 50% rock are more likely to represent this second peak in the exoplanet data, they argue. They reason that the higher gravity associated with larger gas giants meant they would steal most of the hydrogen gas present in the protoplanetary disk, the materials which coalesce to form a planetary system, leaving the smaller planets with high volumes of commonplace ice. What's more, when modelling the atmospheres of these proposed water worlds, the team found that if the planets had the right chemical balance, then methane, ammonia and hydrogen coming from the vast water reservoir could replenish the gradual loss of atmosphere. If the atmosphere remained intact, evaporation from the ocean would be stalled, preserving a possible oasis for life below. On this particular result, Lima remains cautious. Any research on the prevalence of water worlds is still going to be highly uncertain, he says. Still, the consensus about water worlds was shifting. Together with Zung's modelling, findings from ancient meteorites show that ice was a common ingredient in the early solar system, and the detection of water in the atmospheres of several exoplanets have persuaded some astronomers that water was a regular ingredient in the formation of planets. Water, after all, is composed of two of the most abundant elements in the universe, hydrogen and oxygen, and was one of the most common molecules when our own solar system formed. Today, it is generally agreed that there are two kinds of watery exoplanets. The first is a planet that starts further away from its star and contains lots of ice. As it moves closer to its star, the ice melts to form an ocean on the surface, which delays the loss of atmosphere, says Mant. Or, like Enceladus, there is an icy layer keeping the water in. The prevalence of water worlds is going to remain a mystery until we can find them outside our solar system. Luckily, the James Webb Space Telescope, or JWST, is going to spend a lot of time analysing the atmospheric compositions of potential habitable worlds. And there is a system with a possible water world right on our galactic doorstep. TRAPPIST-1, with 7 known rocky worlds, is just 40 light-years from Earth. In 2021, Eric Agol at the University of Washington in Seattle and his team estimated that at least 4 planets in the system could have significant water. The most promising is TRAPPIST-1H, which could be as much as 10% water. Plans to peer at TRAPPIST-1H in the ultraviolet using JWST might just reveal a Titan-like atmosphere that could be indicative of a vast ocean beneath its surface, says Mant. If we find a lot of methane but not much oxygen or carbon monoxide, that would be an indication of cryovolcanic activity and a Titan-like atmosphere, she says. In other words, ice volcanoes. A team led by Mant has now suggested using Saturn's moon Titan, with its subsurface ocean, as a model for making observations of TRAPPIST-1H's atmosphere. The two bodies might have a lot in common. Both exist outside of the habitable zone. Both probably have liquid oceans beneath the frozen surface, and both might have extensive atmospheres. With exoplanets like TRAPPIST-1H, we are limited in the types of observations we can make, whereas with our solar system's icy moons, we are able to look at the surface and make inferences about their compositions directly. This is why using the moons is useful to help us understand exoplanets. If TRAPPIST-1H doesn't have an atmosphere, it doesn't rule out the possibility of an ocean. It might resemble something more like Europa, which has an ocean beneath a thick sheet of ice. Due to its lack of cryovolcanic activity, Europa doesn't really have an atmosphere, except for the occasional plume of material that comes up from the ice, which is quickly lost to space. Learning anything about the moon's composition by observing its atmosphere is virtually impossible. Could life survive on such a world? Promising clues come from another moon. In September 2022, jets spewing from Enceladus were found to contain all of the ingredients necessary for life on Earth: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Hints from Earth also suggest it is possible. In 2021, James Smith and Paul Anker at the British Antarctic Survey discovered an ecosystem of sponges and barnacles 900 metres below the Antarctic ice shelf, 260 kilometres away from the nearest source of water where photosynthetic organisms can survive. The community may use a form of chemosynthesis, with methane and hydrogen sulfide being potential sources of energy. This is one way life could survive in a sunlight-deprived, icy water world. Earth can only tell us so much, however. Adrienne Kish, a microbiologist at the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, in France, says life on Earth co-evolved with our planet. This means that life on Earth is unique to Earth, and life on another world, if it exists, will have undergone a different path, with likely a different end product. Some of the basic building blocks, like amino acids, might be similar, as we have spotted these things in interstellar clouds, but on water worlds, any life would have to be equipped to survive high pressures, high salt content, and extreme temperatures, as the oceans are likely to be cold away from any hydrothermal vents. If TRAPPIST-1H doesn't turn up the goods, there is no shortage of other exoplanets to explore. In 2019, observations made with the Hubble Space Telescope confirmed water in the atmosphere of K2-18b, a planet of around 8 Earth masses in the habitable zone of a red dwarf 124 light-years away. Water was also tentatively detected in the atmosphere of planet LHS 1140b, which is around 7 Earth masses and lies within the habitable zone of its star, which is 40 light-years away. Modelling estimates have suggested the planet could be around 4% water, which is enough for it to have oceans hundreds of kilometres deep. But that pales in comparison with TOI 1452b, discovered in August, whose size and mass suggest it could be 22% water. This planet is 100 light-years from our solar system and orbits a pair of red dwarfs. Its 11-day orbit puts TOI 1452b well within the habitable zone of its 2 parent stars, and René Doyon at the University of Montreal plans on booking time with JWST to get a more detailed look at it soon. One way or another, observing a distant water world seems like a matter of when, not if.
Studying the nits of Laos on a holy relic. Feedback takes a look at the residence of what is described as a large lock of Mary Magdalene's hair, while also pondering the Nobel Committee's decision to overlook Deepak Chopra when handing out this year's physics award.
Holy nitpicking! Nitpicking often draws criticism, but Gérard Lucotte, Areki Isri, and Thierry Thomaset didn't let that deter them from publishing their 6th article in a series of keen looks at some old hairs. It's called Nits of Laos on the Hairs of Holy Maria Magdalena, a SEM EDX study. Lest there be confusion, let's be specific about the hairs. The study says they come from a large lock of Mary Magdalene's hair that was arranged in a dedicated reliquary in the Basilica of the village of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume in southern France. The authors go on to explain that Mary Magdalene is, quote, the most abundantly cited women, and they do say women, not woman, of the 4 Gospels, close quotes. Lucotte, Isri, and Thomaset perused 10 hairs in 2 ways, with scanning electron microscopy, SEM, and energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, EDX. In slightly plainer words, they made microscopic examinations and did chemical analysis. The writing in the paper is sometimes evocative, as in this passage. Quotes, Figure 4 shows a bulging nit adhering to the hair number 7 surface, close quotes. And the final paragraph conveys perhaps hints of suppressed emotion at the keyboard. Quote, Given the great oldness of Maria Magdalena's remains, at one period where hygiene habits were not so drastic as today, it's not so surprising that the hairs of Holy Maria Magdalena would be massively infested by snits, and again I'm using their word, of loose, and again I'm using their word. The team's previous studies of these historic hairs present, quotes, observations of fennel rests, marine micro-remains, silver and gold particles, skin debris, and mineral particles deposited on their hair surfaces. Fennel rests are described as, quotes, pollen grains, leaf, and stem debris. The Knits of Laos study was published in Global Dermatology. On its website, the journal invests the citations of its articles with an easy-to-remember acronym, Global Dermatology, GOD.
Quantum spirituality. Feedback was amused that the person who has best demonstrated that quantum is valuable, that the word quantum has measurable financial worth, went unmentioned when this year's Nobel Prize in Physics was announced to honour research that tested the reality of quantum entanglement. Deepak Chopra has spent decades entangling the word quantum into public discussions of spirituality, happiness and success. But it will be 3 physics professors who will shake a royal hand in Stockholm this December. Those whose understanding of quantum comes from Chopra can but wonder. Chopra is a masterful writer. His prose can suggest every possible meaning simultaneously. See for yourself. Listen to these 2 examples. The limitations of physical life count for much less in the quantum world, and often for nothing. Or, the mind replenishes itself in silence, the quantum source for all activity. Those quantum-centric sentences are the quantum heart of Deepak Chopra's 1993 master quantum work, Ageless Body, Timeless Mind, one edition of which labels itself The Quantum Alternative to Growing Old. In 1998, physicist Roy Glauber, in a ceremony at Harvard University, gave this brief speech in tribute to Chopra. There is not much that I need tell you about relativistic quantum mechanics. Its achievements in the world of atoms and particles have been great. Its successes, on the other hand, in the world of psychiatry and emotional well-being have been few, and it has certainly not been known for them particularly. Not, that is, until the recent work of tonight's honoree. The occasion? The awarding of that year's Ig Nobel Physics Prize to Chopra. 7 years later, the King of Sweden presented Glauber with a Nobel Prize in Physics for his contribution to the quantum theory of optical coherence.
Vulvas for Dummies. Matthew J. Zadia suggested that feedback take a look at his report called What is a Vulva, published recently in the journal Anatomical Science International. The article contains many things of interest to vulva scholars and newbies alike. The first 9 words give an excellent summary of the entire 24-page-long paper. What exactly is a vulva? The question remains unresolved. The What is a format for the titles is reminiscent of the For Dummies format that has had a long, lucrative run in the publishing industry. The potential reader perceives a promise of gentle clarity rather than one of overwhelming abstruseness. Scholarly journals have given the world thousands of reports that sport titles beginning with What is a? Let's peek at a few. Helen Stewart wrote What is a continuant?, which opens, In this book, I explore the question of what a continuant is, in the context of a very interesting suggestion recently made by Roland Stout as part of his attempt to develop a coherent ontology of processes. What is a continuant appears in volume 89 of a journal called Aristotelian Society Supplementary Volume. Mihakovic and his colleagues wrote a paper called What is a Book? It begins, The aim of this paper is to reach a level of conceptual clarity about what we call a book. You might also delight in What is a slur? What is a question? What is an answer? And what is an answer? That is the question.